coming on this early Sunday morning here at ConFusion in the cold and the wintry weather. I'm Brandon Crilly. I'm an Ottawa-based science fiction and fantasy writer, as well as a columnist for Blackgate.com, and a high school history teacher, occasionally teaching European and world history, although I'm not nearly as much of an expert in that as our guest.
Well, it's your job to be broad. It's my job to be narrow.
That is very, very true.
This is teamwork.
Perfect. I like that. Yeah, broad is definitely a good way to describe how I teach my grade 12 history course. So I'm very, very excited to be sitting here with one of ConFusion's guests of honor this weekend, Ada Palmer, who, among a variety of things in an incredibly impressive list of accomplishments and fields, is the author of the Terra Ignota Quartet, which started in 2016 with Two Like the Lightning and finishes this year, correct? With perhaps
in 2020.
Oh, is it 2020?
Yeah, because it's not done yet.
Oh, okay. So it finishes in 2020.
Mostly done. I have a couple chapters to go. I'm hoping to finish it this spring.
Nice. Okay, cool. Okay, so 2020 then with Perhaps the Stars. Ada is also a professor of history at the University of Chicago, a composer of science fiction and fantasy and mythology-themed music, a vocal performer, a manga researcher, and a blogger for Tor.com and Exurb.com, and I'm sure I'm forgetting a bunch of other things, because what she does is vast and incredibly, incredibly exciting and intimidating. So it's very interesting. And I'm actually going to throw my prepared questions out the window to start, because I want to talk about this, which Ada just showed me before we started rolling. And it's an anthology.
So that's an exhibit catalog.
Exhibit catalog, okay.
This is part of a multi-year project on censorship and information control during information revolutions. The idea being that every time a new information technology comes in, it changes the way we try to censor things. And new forms of censorship develop, and old forms of censorship change as a result of the new medium.
Okay.
And there are lots of historians who look at this in the context of the printing press. Mm-hmm. But it's very parallel what happened with the printing press and what's happening now in the digital age. So the idea of the project is to get people who work on the printing press revolution together with people who are working on censorship in the digital revolution to share what we know about things. Because a lot of what is being tried now by corporations or by governments or by social groups is very similar to things that people tried in the wake of the printing press to regulate this new medium.
That's interesting. Can you give me an example of that? Because I think of censorship as a very modern phenomenon.
Oh no, censorship. So our oldest documented case of specific endorsement of censoring a particular author is 300 BC.
Seriously?
And this is Plato endorsing censoring Homer.
Oh.
And we have references to book burnings of Confucian works as early as potentially 500 BC, and there are references to book burnings in the Hebrew Old Testament.
Oh my God.
There are no cases of societies with literature without censorship. The deeper and more broadly we look, the deeper and more broadly it is a constant. And while we tend to think of censorship as a sort of aberration, when your regime goes wrong, then there's censorship.
Yeah, exactly.
I've come after studying it for a long time to think of it more as censorship is one of the elements of society's periodic table.
Okay.
It is always there.
Interesting.
But sometimes it's there in a toxic form. And sometimes it's there in a low concentration and not hurting things very much, right? There's arsenic in this room, but it's not killing anyone.
Right, okay, you're just saying.
But in different combinations, it could.
Okay.
And I think that's a much more accurate way to think about censorship as a constant impulse and a constant presence, but that takes a lot of different forms and structures. And we need to learn how it operates so that we know how to avoid the most toxic forms and minimize its negative impact on a world where it will never be completely absent, because it never has been.
Okay, so you don't think it ever would be?
I mean, certainly in microcosmic moments it can be.
Okay.
But it perennially regenerates. New desires to do it, new impulses to do it keep coming in. Right, particularly because we have a tendency to imagine censorship in a way dominated by Orwell.
Oh, for sure.
Orwell really saturates the way we think of censorship operating. The other thing that tends to saturate our modern imagination of censorship is the way we think the Inquisition worked.
Right.
Which isn't the way the Inquisition worked, but the way we think the Inquisition worked. Our imagined Inquisition and Orwell are the sort of two dominant structures. Orwell gives you a very particular and ahistorical or inaccurate sense of the defaults of censorship. His censorship is extremely centralized,
Right.
top down, has all the resources it could possibly need, right? The Ministry of Truth has all the employees it wants, it has no budget problems, it can police everybody constantly at all
Right.
times,
Yeah,
and it has this stable, multi-decade plan of at this point we will do this, and then we will do this, and
Right,
then,
right.
you know, in 30 years we will advance this far in our system.
Right.
And
No
it's-
hiccups whatsoever.
yeah, and it's absolutely a top-down power structure
Okay.
in which this is being imposed upon a people by a central ordering force. When you look at real cases of censorship, it's almost never like that. A huge portion of censorship is what you could call bottom-up or grassroots censorship.
Okay.
There is a widespread panic about X. The people demand that we do something and censor X, whether this is the comics craze of the 1930s through 50s,
Right.
where there's a popular idea that this is hurting our kids and everyone demands that Congress do something. The Red Scare has very much the same structure. There is a widespread panic about this thing.
Right.
And if you zoom back earlier, you know, when Protestantism begins, there's a widespread panic about Protestantism among
Right.
Catholic populations.
Absolutely.
They call upon the centralized church to be the organ of action upon this,
Okay.
but it's widespread. And another of the characteristics is censoring bodies tend to be rapidly put together in response to a crisis. Oh no, comic books are destroying our kids, quick, let's do something about it.
Right, right.
Oh no, Protestantism is sweeping through our land, quick, let's do something about it. Oh no, X is, you know, people are posting things on Twitter that are terrible in one way or another, quick, let's come up with a structure to do something about it.
Right.
And they tend to always feel like they're understaffed, under-resourced, and desperately trying to keep up with policing a population that's much, much, much larger than the staff that exists.
Right, okay.
Which isn't what Orwell teaches us to look for and be vigilant against. So a lot of the project is about coming to understand real ways censorship tends to operate,
Interesting.
because we can be better vigilant against it when we know how it really works than when we're focused on one particular form of it, which is largely mythical.
Right, okay.
You know, and does reflect, you know, Orwell is basing this partly on his reports, what he's hearing about Soviet Russia, and partly on Britain's wartime censorship during World War II.
Right.
But the ways that he's combining those and the ways that he's stretching and exaggerating them are very particular.
Okay.
And if we generalize those, then we lose our resistance against forms of censorship such as the 1930s through 50s comics craze or these many other structures.
Right, okay. So is it like the motivation for this was in a response to kind of what's going on?
For the project?
For the project, yeah. Like, was it in response to maybe like partly what's going on in the world right now? I don't want to say specifically the United States, but I think it's larger than that. But
It was funny because we started this before everyone decided this was a hot topic. And
So
then it
you were
became
cutting
a
edge,
hot
is what you're
topic
saying.
in the middle. Like suddenly this is a hot topic. We're just having a little project over here. No, it began with me and Cory Doctorow at conventions sitting down in the bar afterward.
nice.
Or in the restaurant afterward, and he would be telling me about something he was working on with digital information freedom, and I would say, oh, that's exactly what happened in Paris in 1623 when blah, 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 blah. And he'd be like, really, tell me more. And I'd be like, well, they passed this policy, and it was a total disaster. And he's like, yes, it will be a total disaster. Microsoft also should not do the thing that Paris did in 1623. And so we kept finding these parallels because often the structures and questions are the same.
Right.
So one of the big structures with any censoring system is it censored before it's released? Or do we let it be released and then try to take it down or control it after it's available?
Right, okay.
And that's something that when the printing press disseminates, the Catholic world and Protestant worlds do these largely backwards. So that the Catholic system is before anything may be printed, you have to go to a local censor, present the work, the censor reads through it, and gives you a permission for it to be printed, and then it may be printed. So
Okay.
it's censorship before.
Right.
In the Protestant world, or in England in particular, which is where the origins of free speech debate as an issue begin, in the regulation of the printing press in England, in the 16th and 17th centuries, the debate is their system at first is censorship after. You may print it. Whatever it is, you may print it, it's on you, but you must put your name and address on it. And
So we
if
can find-
afterward it's judged to be pernicious,
Right.
then we will come for you. But it's on you to police your own speech. And both of these are associations of censorship, right? Neither of these is what we would call a free press. But the arguments, the first one's advanced by John Milton in his second most famous work, the Areopagitica. He argued that you write very differently when you're writing knowing it'll reach the audience and then maybe get you in trouble or not, from when you're waiting for the censor first and the audience second, and you know you have to go through this gatekeeper before it can move outward.
Right.
And right now, as we call upon social media organizations to be more responsible about what's being posted on them, and they are being pressured from a lot of directions to impose censorship. Some of that pressure is governmental, particularly by the governments of China and other countries that have more censorship than the US does. But some of those pressures are grassroots pressures as well, as people demand that X kind of content have some means to take it down.
Right.
The different providers of social media are experimenting with these two models. Do we create a filter system that vets everything before it goes up to try to prevent things from being there in the first place? Or do we create a tagging system in which it goes out there, but then people protest and complain and come to it? And it really is the same thing that the Protestant and Catholic worlds did in the 16th and 17th centuries.
That's interesting.
So the printing press gives us hundreds of years of what happened as a result.
Right, okay.
And you can look at it and say, where did literature thrive more, in this kind of print environment or that kind of print environment? What are the likely effects going to be on dissemination of different kinds of information, scientific information, news, etc., when we look at this? Because a lot of people who are making decisions about the regulation of social media, or indeed of digital media more broadly, feel like they're groping in the dark, making up a policy, that we're in a new world, nothing like this has existed, so we have to come up with something. And the answer is no, this has happened numerous times. This happened with the printing press, this happened with the telegraph, this happened with radio, this happened with television, and we can look to each of these earlier cases. This happened with the proliferation of newspapers, to each of these earlier cases, and see what people tried. And from what people tried, we can then put together predictive attempts to say what's likely to be the result of if we implement A versus if we implement B. Nothing is going to make us be in a world where no social media is trying to censor itself. Different companies will or won't, but some of them are gonna. But we can put ourselves in a world where those decisions are made more intelligently. And that's the idea of the project. So we had a museum exhibit displaying cool censored books. From some of them with passages chopped out with scissors by inquisitors or inked out or altered, others simply ones that had been banned or censored in different contexts. And then we also had a series of discussions where I would fly to campus, some people who work on the modern world and some people who work on the pre-modern world, but who work on parallel questions in those worlds, to have a discussion with me and Corey and our other partner Adrian Johns, who works on print history. So for example, in 1 week we had Nicholas Davidson, who works on Inquisition interrogation records. When the Inquisition is interrogating someone, what kind of records do they produce? What do they document about it? What don't they document about it? And what can we learn about what they think the goal is of the interrogation from their own records? And we paired him with Joshua Craze, who works on the interrogation records from Guantanamo Bay and the US War on Terror, to then compare those documents to each other, what each of them includes, what each of them excludes, what we can learn about what the person in the room imagines is the purpose of this interrogation from the way the two are documented and represented, and then how they are or aren't made available to the public. So we've got a series of 9 of these discussions on different subjects, ranging from censorship of theater to radical free speech. So one of our participants was Kathleen Ballou, who works on the history of the KKK. And the KKK's use of innovative information technologies like the Ditto machine and the Xerox machine, which were integral to the continuation of the KKK by enabling it to produce low-cost flyers and low-cost pamphlets with which it could do recruiting. So fandom did this too, right? The advent of the Ditto machine and the Xerox machine made it much easier for geographically disparate subcultures to coalesce and organize conventions. And just as it was at a major turning point in the history of the fandom community, allowing us to find each other and allowing conventions to organize and newsletters and the production of fiction and all of this, The same is true of the KKK in the same moment.
Wow.
Making you think about how every new information technology does revolutionize all previous ones, but also social networking capacity, and therefore what kinds of censorship people then attempt or don't attempt to implement. So all of these were filmed, all of them are online on our YouTube channel, so anyone who's interested in watching them, they're there.
Yeah. Okay.
And eventually we're also going to do a book of essays by all of the participants reflecting on the content.
Cool.
So that'll be cool.
Holy crap. See, now I want to talk about that for like 40 minutes, but I feel like if we don't talk about other stuff, someone's going to have my head. But that sounds absolutely fascinating. He said, okay, YouTube, I'm going to write that down.
Yep.
Wow. So you mentioned the Catholic Church and Protestantism and religion a little bit as we've been talking.
Yeah.
And one of the things I found very interesting, I've only read the first of your Terra Ignota books, so that's the perspective I'm coming from. But I find the take on religion in there I found absolutely fascinating, because you've got this secularization of society and then recognizing the need that you're always going to need someone to go to for questions about kind of the broader universe and life and that sort of thing. And what I found very interesting was this almost like sense of longing, this sense of loss for having realized, at least in my impression of it, it was that, there's this sense that you can't be 100% secular because there's always these questions. Given how secular it seems Western society is continuing to become, do you see...
I mean, the number of churches in the U.S. is still growing per capita.
Right, which I'm talking, because maybe we're not becoming more secular, maybe it's just a perception.
Well, you have to divide Western society in half. Europe, religiosity is going down.
Right, okay.
Church attendance is going down.
Okay.
Church communities are shrinking. U.S., it's growing.
Okay.
We have this tendency to think that a trend ought to be homogenous in the West, and that we should be comparing West to other stuff.
Okay, that's a very good point.
But you really do have to subdivide both the West and the Anglophone worlds, because these don't have the same trends happening right now.
Okay, so that still goes to what I want to ask you, which is that, do you see kind of the relationship, either in Europe or in the United States or whichever part of the world, taking a similar path as what you have in your books? Right.
So when I think one of the differences between the way I world built my future and the way people who aren't historians tend to world build their futures is that I didn't take the present as the starting point.
Okay.
I took 300 years ago as the starting point.
Okay.
And said, okay, what has been changing that will likely continue to change?
Okay.
So a number of major elements of our society are, from a multi-century point of view, unstable right now because they're comparatively recent human developments.
Okay.
One of these is the relationship between politics and religion, or organized religion and private religion, which has been continually in flux since the Reformation. It had been comparatively stable, the political ends of it at least, for several centuries before that, but it's been in a kind of constant flux since. Another example of something that's been changing in that period is the family unit. What is a family unit? Right now we have this focus on the nuclear family with one couple that moves out from their parents and raises children in a sort of atomized state. But that's incredibly recent.
Oh, for sure.
Compared to a much longer history where it was an extended family within a house, or multi-family households layered on top of each other. If I'm looking at the Renaissance, we often have the family who owns the house and then the families of servants who live with the house, who have multi-generational relationships and live with each other in the house over a century, and their descendants continue in these relationships. So I went through and looked at what on that multi-century time scale is really new at the moment or changing at the moment.
Okay.
And gender relations, it feels like gender relations are changing very acutely right now as if they weren't a few years ago.
Right.
But they really started changing very acutely in the French Enlightenment with some of the first big arguments about gender equality. There had to have been arguments about gender equality made before that point. I mean, Plato makes this argument in 300 BC. But those go in and out of people paying attention to them. And we have a number of them from the 16th century, for example, that just don't get traction. We don't have responses to them. They're made, a few people who know the person who's making it might respond, But in the 18th century, we have publications and thousands of copies of works by Voltaire, or by Diderot, or by Montesquieu, or by Mary Wollstonecraft, or by Emily de Châtelet. Well, her legacy is different. Or Margaret Cavendish, that really challenge and complexify what this is. And it starts changing at that point and is still changing now and is going to continue changing.
Right, okay.
So I made myself a kind of checklist of what's in flux. It's going to be different in this future.
Okay.
What's a way it could be different?
Right.
Not trying to care about whether I'm guessing correctly about how it will be different, but depicting it as being the same is what I think would be wrong.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and so in the case of religiosity, I was very aware of how there have been surveys recently in the U.S. in particular in which the percentage of the population that this will be a survey that asks you what religion are you.
Okay.
And there are moments recently that's been a big trend where the number of people who answer Christian has been going down.
Okay.
And the number of people who answer other has been going up.
Oh, interesting.
And then when you interview the people, their answer is, well, actually, I'm a Christian, but I hate what the Christian right is doing so publicly in politics, and I don't feel comfortable identifying with that. But my private religiosity is shaped by the Christian holy book.
Right, okay.
So people are wanting to be able to sort of distance themselves from that Christianity and create their own Christianity, which made me remember the lament that you often heard in the Reformation, that if people start translating the Bible into common languages and everyone starts reading it, quote, soon there will be as many Christianities as there are Christians,
right,
end quote. And I was like, okay, well, what if we have that one be right? And what if we have a continued atomization where people find themselves more and more alienated from large, loud, organized religion, which is getting more and more politicized in a particularly conservative direction in a lot of ways, and yet the hunger for private religion doesn't decrease.
Right, okay.
What does that do? How does that affect Christianity? How does that affect Islam? How does that affect Buddhism? How does that affect Judaism differently?
Right, yeah.
And created a world which I love how it polarizes people when they read about that kind of religiosity, because some people read it and think, wow, this is the best, this is the most wonderfully utopian way for religion to work I could ever imagine, because nobody can shove their religion on your face, nobody's religion can be messed up in politics, or trying to, my parents can't lecture me on this junk, nobody has to go through being forced into a religion, and yet everybody has freedom of belief. That's great.
Right.
And other people read it and say, this is horrible, I couldn't pass on my traditions, I couldn't have a bar mitzvah, I couldn't get together with my community and share our legacy and our culture. This is absolutely oppressive totalitarianism.
Yeah.
And it'll be like a pair of roommates that have these opposite reactions to the same thing. And I love that because it gets people to see what religion is for and how it has both the private belief element and the public structures element, and these two can be in tension, but don't need to be. And ideally, we want to develop systems where they aren't.
Right.
But I depicted one where they are. And where you have to think very cleverly about, okay, how does the Jewish community of this world navigate being forbidden to have group ceremonial things, but absolutely wanting to continue the traditions of having group ceremonial things in a world that finds them frightening.
Right.
And we find little snippets and more details about that as the books go on, and there will indeed be more in book 4.
Okay, cool.
But a lot of it is really centered on that process of saying, okay, 21st century isn't the beginning.
Right.
20th century isn't the beginning.
Right.
18th century, 17th century, those are the beginning, and then we see how the trends have begun so that we can then continue them.
Right, okay. Did you worry about the accessibility of your books, like given how much it's rooted in history and thinkers, and there's tons of references and allusions to individuals from history that maybe not everybody is familiar with? So did you worry about people being able to get into your book and really understand what it is that is going on?
No, in 3 ways.
Okay.
No, the first, I expected it to be a really niche book that not a lot of people would read. So did Tor. Everyone was surprised how many people read it, which is why it sold out in pre-order, because they didn't make very many copies of it. And then everyone was like, I actually want this book, and everyone was delighted.
Awesome.
Because Tor sometimes put the thing out because they think this thing is great, and it won't be a moneymaker, but it's great, and we want to support it anyway, which is one of the things that being the biggest SF press lets Tor do.
Right.
Smaller presses often don't have the leisure to gamble in that way. So I was really fortunate to be in that position. But we always expected to have a niche audience. So that's the first third of the no.
Okay.
The second third is I designed it to read like a real historical document.
Mm-hmm.
Right? This isn't a narrative in which we are in the head of a protagonist sort of following it along like a video camera. This is a document that has been written by a historian at a time, and like any historical document, and I'm very familiar with reading historical documents, it's got edges of impenetrability because the audience for whom the historian is writing it isn't us.
Right, okay.
And the historian explains what he thinks needs to be explained and doesn't explain what he doesn't think needs to be explained. And all real historical documents are like that. And you're reading a letter, and the letter explains at great, great length what, Catholicism is, and you're like, yeah, I know. Yeah. And then mentions Carson Kappa, and you're like, what? And it never explains what that is, because everybody in the period obviously knows what that is.
Of course.
And you're left in a state of utter bewilderment. You can also see this sometimes in fiction. So, for example, the delightful Sherlock Holmes original short story of the 5 Orange Pips, right, revolves around you never having heard of the KKK. And the big dramatic reveal at the end is when he explains what the KKK is. And it just utterly doesn't work because we know. And we're sitting here through most of the story being like, so what's the mystery? There's this secret organization from the US whose initials are KKK that's murdering people who are associated with involvement in the politics around giving the vote to African Americans. I don't understand what the suspense is supposed to. Oh, nobody he's writing for knows what this is. I get it, man. So reading historical documents is itself a special kind of mystery puzzle.
Okay.
In which you're trying to piece out the information you need, as the author of the document is giving the information that the expected reader of the document needs, but that isn't the information you need.
Right, okay.
And so you have in front of you the inventory of objects that were in Lorenzo de' Medici's house when he died, for example, which was done for his tax purposes.
Right.
And it has incredible detail on every single piece of linen and napkins and exactly which city the cloth is from.
Right, of course.
And then it says painting with 5 people. And you're like, is that Botticelli's Primavera? Is that not Botticelli's Primavera? I know you have Botticelli's Primavera. Is it but this is a tax inventory. They don't care.
Exactly, yeah.
Paintings are worth nothing. They don't care. But napkins, we need to know where they are from so we can tax them appropriately. And you're like, thank you, people who are not anticipating the needs of the historian who will someday read this. God. So I wanted to reconstruct that experience, the experience the historian has of coming to a document and doing the extra puzzle hunting mystery work of this. The intended audience of this isn't quite me.
Right.
And I have to puzzle things out, and that itself is fun for some people, not for everybody, but I was writing this for the kind of person for whom that's fun.
For sure.
And so you get to be a historian of this 2454, trying to learn about it from a narrative that isn't quite designed to tell you about it. And so I have him explain some things at length, and other things not explain at all. And that itself is a feature.
Right.
Because it gives you an extra level of mystery to get to play with. And then the third part is that the core stuff, I did have him explain the stuff that I consider indispensable. He explains who Voltaire and Diderot are, so that you're with it. He explains what's really up with the Marquis de Sade as opposed to what people usually know. So the essential backbone stuff, I do to make sure is in there.
Okay, good. Speaking of Mycroft specifically, and again, does anybody care about spoilers? Can I talk about stuff
I care about spoilers.
Okay, but then I will not be very specific.
We can be cunningly circumspect.
Perfect. So all I will ask then is, given what we learn about him over the course of the book,
yes,
and I'm thinking particularly near the end of the book, without giving anything away, as a reader, and again, like I presume that there is even more that is unpacked the further we get into this series. But do you, like, as a reader, like, finding that out about him, and what that changes about our perception of him, why should I trust him going forward? Right? And that's the question that was the tip of my mind of, like, why, like, how can I go into the next book trusting that character? And was that a concern at all? I just want your perspective on that.
Well, I mean, the category of unreliable narrator, we talk about it as if it's a binary, as if a narrator is either reliable or unreliable. It's much more complicated than that, because there are so many different ways that a narrator can be reliable or unreliable.
Okay.
And as we get to know Mycroft better, we learn different elements about what is and isn't reliable with Mycroft. Because Mycroft tells you at the very beginning that he is a criminal, that he's been condemned for a terrible, terrible crime. You don't know what it is. People make all different guesses about what it is. And he tells you that he's mad. Right at the beginning, in the first chapter, he tells you that he's a madman. And that nobody listens to him. And so then you have to say, okay, he believes himself to be insane. In what ways is he insane? What parts of this narration are reliable? What parts of it aren't? And as we learn about him, we learn different things. So, for example, we know he's very strongly biased. And there are some people that he thinks are amazing, and he talks about them like they're superhuman angel people. And there are other people that he just loathes. And when he describes them, he genuinely hallucinates like cancerous fog leaking out of reality around this person, because that's how bad the person is. And you, the reader, says, I don't think that fog is really there, because this narrator is unreliable. And we also learn about why he's writing it, and that he's trying to communicate to us about these days of transformation, and that desire to communicate is sincere. And that when he's messing up, it's not out of an intention to deceive, but because he genuinely thinks that this is the way to tell the story that will be clearest in getting it across. And he makes that very clear, both by saying so and when we see him do stuff. But he also does stuff that's really weird, like whenever Thisbe shows up, he calls Thisbe a witch. And then we're like, Mycroft, don't call Thisbe a witch. And he's like, sorry, reader, I just keep habitually calling her a witch. I'm weird. And you're like, yes, you are, Mycroft.
So there's this like back and forth dialogue.
So as you advance through the series and get to know him better, you know better what is reliable and what isn't reliable. And so the question, can I trust Mycroft? The answer is always sometimes. And the question has always been sometimes. Because you can't trust him about people that he hates so much that he hallucinates cancerous fog leaking through reality. You can trust him to be sincerely trying to communicate to you what he thinks the truth is. You can't be confident that he's correct as to what the truth is, but that he has a lot of knowledge of things and is useful to you as a tool to get at that truth. So again, it's a complicated combing process of learning what can I and can't I rely upon with him. And in every book, more things unfold which further complicate your understanding of how insane Mycroft is and how reliable or unreliable Mycroft is at any given stage. So that you can then think back on things and think, oh, interesting, if this thing, which I now know is true of Mycroft, is true, then what does that mean about that chapter in the earlier book where he said that this happened? I wonder whether in fact it was this other thing. And we know the books have been censored. The very first page you get in every book is the censor's marks and saying this has been approved by all of these groups. So it's also unreliable beyond Mycroft. Because it's been altered after leaving his hands.
That's interesting.
And so again, it's for people who enjoy the puzzle, who enjoy the puzzle of there are all of these extra obstacle course challenges to getting at a truth of what's in there. And you and your friend who's also reading the book may in fact come at different ideas of what's actually going on in there, and in this particular scene, whether this really happened or didn't happen. And I've talked to people who've gone all the way through book 1 and halfway through book 2, or even all the way through book 2, confident that Bridger isn't real and that Bridger's powers aren't real.
Interesting.
Because that's absolutely within the scope of what Mycroft might just be being insane about. And you get a very different experience of the book if you believe that.
Right, yeah.
From if you don't.
Absolutely.
And that's intentional, that pluralizing of the reader experience.
Okay.
Is intentional and is based on my own experience as a historian and a reader of historical documents.
Right.
Where I can go to a document and read it, and another historian will come to the same document and read it and come up with a completely different impression of these people, what they did, who's a good guy, who's a bad guy. In that particular situation, because it has to do with how we cut through what isn't there to try to get at the core that we feel is there.
Okay, interesting. Like as a, I mean, with all of the work that you do in the historical research, do you get much time to read, or do you read much like sci-fi and fantasy novels that are coming out? Like... So
not a lot of novels, largely because I have a very spongy prose ear. And if I read somebody, the next chapter comes out reading like that person's prose.
Wow.
And you can really tell, like, Boyd has been reading Gene Wolfe today. It sure reads like Gene Wolfe.
Interesting.
So when I'm actively writing, I don't read very much long-form prose fiction. I read short stories, which are brief enough, and I can read several together that no one prose style dominates.
Right, okay.
So if I sit down with a multi-author anthology of short fiction, I can come out of that having really enjoyed it, but not having the prose sponge effect.
Right, okay.
And I read a lot of manga.
Right, okay.
Which provides very interesting narrative stuff that's happening, but doesn't give you a narrative prose style.
Right.
So there's no sponging effect.
Okay, gotcha.
So when I'm between projects, then I will certainly read several novels that I've been looking forward to for quite some time. And in the meanwhile, I have my friends read novels and tell me about them, so that I can keep up with the genre and awesome. Tell what's going on, while I limit myself mainly to short fiction, summaries of novels, and manga.
Oh, okay. Are there any particular authors or like even short works lately that have really fascinated you?
So I'm in love with this short story by Michael Shea, The Autopsy. Okay. Which is, I forget whether it was a Hugo or World Fantasy winner, but it's in the brilliant short fiction collection, The Weird, edited by Jeff and Ann Vandermeer. This is a chronologically organized anthology of the weird horror genre, meaning not slasher horror, but like there's an existential thing horror, from late 19th century to contemporary.
Interesting. Okay.
And it gives you a chronology of the genre. And what's really powerful about it is that it nests the people we still read among the people that we don't, to give you a sense of what was actually that person and what that we associate that person was the state of the genre at the time. So we read Lovecraft. We don't really read anyone else from the decades that Lovecraft was a dominant voice.
Right.
And if you read several other short stories that were big at the moment that Lovecraft was writing, and then read the Dunwich Horror, you suddenly see, I see, these are the characteristics that really were Lovecraft and what made him stand out among his peers.
Right, okay.
These are the characteristics that were common to the genre and the state of the genre at that time.
Interesting.
And were the dominant conversations it was having. So it does the same with Kafka, which is brilliant.
Okay.
He's a horror short story writer, but we don't think of him as one. And we never read him alongside his peers.
Okay.
So it's a brilliant collection. Humongous, brilliant. But this one short story, The Autopsy, I'm just so delighted by the way it uses the rapidly achieved characterization of the protagonist narrator figure. There's nothing I can talk about why it's so outstanding that isn't a spoiler. But it's so outstanding. And I'm just fascinated by it as a structure and by it as an examination of what can be triumph in the middle of what is also not triumph. It's so good. So I've been reading it like almost every week, trying to think through its structures and so on, because I admire short story writers. I've tried and failed to write short stories. It's a brilliant form, and I kept thinking maybe if I just read enough of them, I will absorb it. Nope. It's a really admirable and difficult.
Wait, what is it about short story writing that you find that you struggle with?
I don't know. I just never. You have to have a thing that's so self-contained and that comes to a satisfying finish so intently.
Right. Okay.
And my puzzle boxes always extend their tendrils out to further things, and I'm great at I set this up in the dedication of book 1, and it's gonna have fruit in chapter 13 of book 4, kind of thing.
Right. Okay.
But not I've set this up, and in 3 pages it'll blossom.
Right. I see what you're saying.
And give you that feeling of wow.
Right. Yeah.
I keep trying. I just never succeed.
Does it take a lot for you to be like as wowed and as fascinated by work as you are for the weird, or?
No, I get wowed by things a lot.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
And I also, like many people, I also read and enjoy lots of things that I think are thoroughly mediocre, but nonetheless delight me enormously because they're doing something interesting, or they aren't doing something interesting, but the way it's not interesting is interesting, or the way it's riffing on something else.
Right. Okay.
Or I'll be, or this will be a mashup of 2 genres that I like, and that have nothing to do with each other, and then I'm interested to see what happens when they work together. So I've just started a manga called Versailles of the Dead.
Interesting.
Which is Rose of Versailles, the classic foundational shoujo romance, gender-focused thing set at the court of Versailles, but with zombies.
Oh my
And there are zombies all over Versailles, and all the characters are pretty much identical to the characters in Rose of Versailles, except now there's zombies everywhere.
Wow.
And these genres don't go together at all. And it's very entertaining so far. I'm only halfway through the first volume, but I'm really reading it as an examination of these genres. Wow. Can they coexist? What happens when you make them coexist?
Okay.
Can this be more successful or less successful? So far, less successful than, what's it called? What's the Requiem for the Rose King.
Okay.
This is the manga version of Richard III.
Oh, wow.
The gender switchy manga version of Richard III with lots of violence and some demonic stuff happening in it. Yeah, and it's not a masterpiece, but it's really helpful for thinking through genre. And I think one of the things that helps any writer is the art of taking any genre you like, looking at lots and lots of examples of it, revisiting them in detail, and zooming in and understanding how they work.
Right, okay.
Whatever the genre is and whatever the quality of them are. And in fact, if you only read the best stuff, you don't get to compare it to the other stuff that isn't doing that.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And there's kinds of literature that are semi-genre independent, or you can come to and read it and be new to the genre and get it.
Right, okay.
And then there are other kinds which are super, super nested in that subgenre, and it's commenting on that genre and its history, and it's a very different kind of writing.
Right, for sure.
And both of them can be absolutely brilliant. But I'm really fascinated by those works that are lovingly taking apart and putting back together the real details of that genre. I just finished rereading the Dark Age story arc of Kurt Busiek's Astro City.
Okay.
Which is a magnificent comic series looking at big universe Marvel DC type comics.
Oh, interesting.
All the way through, it's brilliant. I can't recommend it enough. And the good description of it is that it zooms in on the more realistic human conversations and human interactions that we always think about must be happening in these universes, but we never see them because we only see the action scenes.
Right.
So the first volume, for example, contains the scene in which the guy who's the equivalent of Superman and the woman who's the equivalent of Wonder Woman get together to talk about her activism as a feminist and the way she takes time away from rescuing people to do feminist activism, and whether that is saving lives long term at the cost of short term, and what that means. And she talks to him about the ethics of the time he spends having a secret identity, and he would save more people. We think this through, but we never have the superheroes actually discuss it. And he also has zooming in on things like what's it like to be a reporter in this world? What's it like to be a comic book writer in a world with real comic type superheroes, etc.? But the Dark Age story arc is about when comics turn dark. And we're familiar with these moments. There will be moments where Marvel or DC is like, all right, time to be gritty. And now Batman is going to kill people, and Batman didn't kill people before, but he's going, or now Wolverine is going to kill people, and he didn't kill people before, but he didn't, and we're going to do this sort of dark turn thing, and it, they always come up with excuses for why it's happening in the narrative, but the real reason is the larger executive. It's time to have the dark turn, right?
Right, yeah.
Well, so America was kind of like that through the Vietnam era and the Korean War era, and this moment of a sort of a dark turn of the character of the 20th century.
Yeah.
So this is a flashback sequence in which he's having those two happen in parallel.
Oh, interesting.
And the cultural tensions around Vietnam and around the darkness of America's actual historical experience, and the moment when the superheroes turn dark and turn fatal, and the moment when we lose confidence in the guy who's the equivalent of Captain America, and are suspicious of him, being together. So it's a history of what it's like when those genre subtleties happen, layered with a history of the 20th century. And it's brilliant, and it would be nonsense if you've never read in this genre.
Right, of course.
But it can only work within that genre, and I think it's really valuable to study and know genres well and understand how that kind of subtlety can be done.
Right.
And then how different that is from a work that's sort of genre independent.
Right, okay.
And both of them can be brilliant.
Yeah. That's very cool. So I can't believe this, but we're almost out of time. So what I like to do at the end of these interviews is rapid fire questions, if you're okay with that. So don't overthink it, just
okay with it, but not good at it.
And we'll see how we do.
I like to answer questions thoroughly.
But this time you can't.
Okay.
Because I'm terrible. So just the first thing that comes to your mind, and they're meant to be super, super short.
Okay.
If that's okay with everybody. Okay, do your best. So.
High stakes.
Yeah, very high stakes. This is for all the money. What do you think of yourself as more, a teacher or a writer?
A writer.
Favorite historical period? Don't overthink it.
Enlightenment.
Favorite?
Renaissance is great, but.
Okay. Enlightenment over Renaissance, noted. Favorite Enlightenment thinker?
Diderot.
Oh, okay, cool.
No question.
No question. Okay, awesome. And you sort of mentioned this before, but something you've never written and don't think you could pull off besides short fiction.
Besides short fiction.
Yeah, very genre specific.
Short fiction.
If it's just short fiction, that's fine.
Sappy, drippy romance.
Oh, interesting.
I don't think I could do the deepest investment in the narrative being the romance.
Okay, fair enough.
I'm very interested in deep emotional investment in friendship. I'm very interested in deep emotional investment in loyalty.
Okay.
And I'm very interested in deep emotional investment among two people who are already together and love each other very much.
Oh, yeah.
But not the stakes is whether they will get together.
Right, not the will they or won't.
I love the Addams Family movie, and Morticia and Gomez love each other, and they're together, and their romance is never threatened by anything, and it's about the two of them enduring stuff together. That's great.
That's awesome.
But this whole thing where the tease is, will they get together? Of course they'll get together at the end. It's not interesting. It's much more interesting to see two human beings in partnership facing the world.
Okay.
So I think that kind of romance can be immensely powerful. I read romances. I love them.
Sure.
I have a giant bookcase full of JoJo romances.
Nice.
But I just don't structure things that way. It's sort of together or not together.
Or not, yeah. Okay, I'm with you there. Cool. Do you ever go on Goodreads?
Very rarely when I have to update a picture.
Okay. Best part of being a writer?
Getting to stimulate new ideas and conversations in people's heads, and then hear what they've been doing with the ideas that I launched out into the world. But it's a conversation. We've all been benefiting from the earlier stages of the conversation that other writers worked hard to pass on to us, and I'm getting to contribute and pass it forward to others.
Awesome.
To continue.
Worst part of being a writer?
I don't have enough time. And I can't spell.
Oh no.
At all, really. I can't even, after years of trying, I can't even spell bureaucracy similarly enough to correct for Microsoft Word to guess what I meant. I really can't spell at all. And when
all of this is even more phenomenal.
When I have to put things on the blackboard, or class students are like, how do you spell that? And I'm like, don't ask me. Someone else look it up and tell me, and I'll put it on the board.
Oh my God.
I have a PhD in Renaissance history.
Yeah.
I still misspell Renaissance. Frequently. There's double letters, and there's other things that could plausibly be double letters, but might not be. It's a hard word.
It is. It's a complicated word.
English is terrible.
English is the worst. Oh, that's delightful. Is there an author you go to for advice?
Is there an author I go to for advice?
If not, that's okay. Not everybody has one.
I mean, I hang out with Joe Alton a lot and
okay.
exchange thoughts, but also with Max Gladstone a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Bouncy ideas, I would say.
They're
And
both
Cory
lovely.
Doctorow.
Right, of course, yeah.
But there's no one
No, okay, that's a whole bunch. That's
network.
good. Okay. Describe undergraduate students in one word.
They're great.
Really?
They're hyper.
I'm a teacher too. You can go with a different one. It's fine.
They're brilliant. This is the University of Chicago. The students are amazing. The students are, and when I run my paper election simulation lab, like I've run it in other contexts, but nowhere else. I get text messages at 2 in the morning. Here's my 300-word plan for saving Milan. Can you tell me if you think it's in a line with Ghibelline interests sufficiently that the Holy Roman Emperor will work with me? And I'm like, you are an amazing student. You had not heard of any of these words a week ago. And here we are at 2 in the morning. It's amazing.
Oh my
They're
God.
great.
Okay.
Great.
Okay, great. And then last but certainly not least, one piece of writing advice to leave our audience with.
Take an old thing you wrote, particularly if it's not a high-stakes thing like a story. It could be an essay from school. It could be a longish email you wrote 2 years ago.
Okay.
Sit down and make yourself edit it down to half length.
Oh, interesting.
You learn to edit your own prose. You learn where you are unnecessarily repetitive. You learn which words you overuse. And you get to that compactness where every line and every sentence and every phrase in there is doing some work and not unnecessary.
Okay.
And when I did this, I mean, often we do this when we are told the word limit is X and the thing is over and you must get it below 9,000 or you are doomed. But it's an incredibly useful skill for mastering your own writing. And in the old novel project that I was working on the first time I did this, there's just this line, and you can tell the moment at which I stopped and had to do that to get the academic paper I was doing down under length, and then boom, suddenly the prose is better.
Oh, interesting.
Because it's not about writing short or writing Spartanly. I mean, anyone who's looked at my prose knows that it is very lush. But every phrase is doing work. And it didn't used to be that way. I learned to do that by the exercise of going to my old writing. And I did it with academic writing, but you can do it with anything you've written. Better when it's a low-stakes thing.
Right.
And a thing that you haven't looked at for at least 6 months. And you learn how to make your own prose tight and concise. Or, those both sound like I mean short, and I don't. Sometimes you want the long, flowing, beautiful sentence. But you want every phrase in that long, flowing, beautiful sentence to be doing something that has to be there.
Right.
And when you make yourself cut a thing down, you learn that.
Okay, very cool. Awesome. We are very much at the end of our time, but thank you very much, Ada. This was a blast. I hope you enjoyed, and enjoy the rest of your content. And thank you. This was so great.
This was lots of fun.